In order to line up where we are on our chart, we need to know two things. We need to know how many standard deviations we moved in each direction, to the left and to the right, and we need to know whether we're using the empirical rule or Chebyshev's rule. So the first one's somewhat easy. As I read across the description, I look for whether they say something like mound-shaped, normal distribution, bell curve, anything that tells me that I can use the empirical rule. Otherwise, I'm going to look for it to say something like unknown distribution or tell me we don't have details, in which case I'm going to use Chebyshev. When I read the first one, it tells me a distribution of measurements is relatively mound-shaped. Those words, relatively mound-shaped, tell me I'm using the empirical rule. Now that I know I'm using the empirical rule, I need to know which row I'm in. Am I plus or minus 1, 2, or 3 standard deviations? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out the mean of 90 and the standard deviation of 20. Using my two between numbers, I'm going to subtract the mean. So 50 and 130, I'm going to subtract from that the mean of 90. When I do it for 50, I get negative 40. When I do it for 130, I get positive 40. That tells me the raw distance that I've moved from the mean. So I move 40 to the left, I move 40 to the right. But that 40 has no context without the standard deviation. With the standard deviation of 20, I can divide by 20 to say, I know I went 40 that way, I know I went 40 that way, but how many standard deviations was that? Negative 40 divided by 20 gives me negative 2. 40 divided by 20 gives me positive 2. That's how I know I went plus or minus 2 standard deviations. If I line up plus or minus 2 standard deviations with the empirical rule, it should give me 0.95. Remember, we're putting these in as proportions for the Cengage homework. Here it asks me what proportion of the measurements. That's why I'm writing it as a decimal, 0.95. In general, when I ask the questions in class, I ask for percentages, so that's how I'm used to displaying them. But here in Cengage, they want it as a decimal. Question 2 starts out the same way. I see these words relatively mound-shaped. That tells me I'll be using empirical rule, not Chebyshev. Here's my mean, 35. Here's my standard deviation, 4. So I'm going to take the two numbers, 23 and 47, that are from my between for my given interval. From that, I'm going to subtract the mean that was given to me as 35. 23 minus 35 gives me negative 12. 47 minus 35 gives me positive 12. If I then divide by the given standard deviation of 4, that's how I get negative 3 and positive 3, telling me that I went plus or minus 3 standard deviations. Again, the relatively mound shape tells me I'm in my empirical rule column, so that should line up to 0.997 as my proportion. When I look at number 3, a distribution of measurements has a mean of 35 and a standard deviation of 7. You know nothing about the size or shape. This nothing about the size or shape is in contrast to when we knew it was relatively mound-shaped. Relatively mound-shaped, we're in column 1, we're using the empirical rule. Nothing about the size or shape of the distribution, unknown distribution, that's when we use Chebyshev's rule. Before we can apply Chebyshev's rule, looking in the second column, we're going to need to figure out how many standard deviations we moved in each direction. So again, we take 21 and 49, same way we did for the empirical rule. Subtract the mean, in this case 35. This gives me negative 14, this gives me positive 14. Just a note, the between numbers are always going to be the same distance away, so I'm always going to get one negative, one positive. It's absolutely fine to just do one or the other and not do both, and you'll still know how many standard deviations you are. That said, I like to show it as both, so here I'm going to divide by the given standard deviation of 7. Here I would get negative 2 and positive 2, so that tells me I'm plus or minus 2 standard deviations. Back when I was in my empirical rule column, that got me to 0.95, but here when I'm doing Chebyshev's rule, that's the far right, that tells me that the proportion is 0.75. So again, the key skill here is having in front of you the chart with the 6 possibilities. First figuring out, did they tell me mound shape, bell curve, something that says that I'm using empirical rule, or did they tell me unknown, tell me they don't know something like the size and the shape of the distribution, telling me Chebyshev's. Once I can line up what column I'm in, I need to do this math to find out what row I'm in. When I line up row and column, it tells me the proportion.